September the 2nd, 1945, 9:04 in the morning. General Yoshijiro Umezu leaned over a green cloth table on the deck of an American battleship and signed his name. He did not bow. He did not look up. He straightened his back and stood at rigid attention while the man who had destroyed his armies signed beneath him. MacArthur did not flinch. He did not demand an apology. He did not raise his voice. Here is what almost nobody talks about. 18 hours earlier, a group of Japanese army officers had stormed the imperial palace with pistols and swords, hunting for a single recording. Not a weapon, not a battle plan, a phonograph disc containing the emperor's own voice, ordering Japan to lay down its arms. If those officers had found that disc and destroyed it before dawn, the ceremony on that battleship might never have happened at all. It did happen. And when Umezu refused to bow in front of hundreds of witnesses, he believed he was making a statement that history would remember forever. You defeated our armies. You did not break us. MacArthur had already prepared for exactly this moment. What he had quietly built into that ceremony made the bow completely irrelevant before Umezu ever set foot on the gangway. What was it? And why would it take MacArthur 6 more years, and one decision about the emperor himself that terrified his own government, to finish what that gray morning had only just begun? It's always an honor to have history lovers here. Where are you watching from today? The sky over Tokyo Bay on the morning of September the 2nd, 1945, was flat and gray. No dramatic sunlight, no cinematic clarity. Just the low overcast of a Pacific morning, and several hundred American officers and enlisted men lining every deck of the USS Missouri in absolute silence. That silence was not an accident. It had been arranged as carefully as everything else on that ship. There was no cheering, there was no jeering, just the specific, weighted quiet of men who had already won and were now waiting for the paperwork to catch up with reality. To understand why that quiet mattered, you have to go back 18 days. On August the 15th, 1945, the people of Japan heard something that had never happened before in the history of their nation. The voice of Emperor Hirohito, broadcast over the radio, announcing that Japan would accept the terms of surrender. It was the first time in his life that Hirohito had ever spoken directly to his own people. Millions of Japanese citizens had never even heard the sound of his voice. Some wept. Some simply could not process what they were hearing. Across the Pacific, in headquarters filled with men who had been fighting this war for nearly 4 years, a single thought began to form. It's over. But General Douglas MacArthur, the man about to be named Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, did not believe it was over. Not yet. Not in any way that mattered. He had studied Japan for decades, and he understood something that the men celebrating around him did not fully grasp. A surrender broadcast on the radio was a beginning, not an ending. It had to be made permanent. It had to be witnessed. It had to be built into the physical record of history in a way that could never be softened, reinterpreted, or erased. He had roughly 18 days to design exactly how that would happen. What almost nobody remembers is how close those 18 days came to never existing at all. On the night of August the 14th, only hours after Hirohito had recorded his surrender message onto a phonograph disc, a group of junior army officers decided they would not let it reach the airwaves. Led by a major named Kenji Hatanaka, the rebels stormed the grounds of the imperial palace with pistols and drawn swords. Their plan was simple and desperate. Seize the palace, find the recording, destroy it before dawn, convince the rest of the imperial army to keep fighting. To take the palace, they needed the cooperation of the officer commanding the Imperial Guard, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori. He refused. The rebels murdered him where he stood, along with his brother-in-law. Then they tore through the palace grounds, searching every room, every vault, every closet, hunting for a single disc that could undo everything Hirohito had just recorded. They never found it. Palace officials had hidden it inside a basket of laundry. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Loyal troops had surrounded and dismantled the rebellion. Hatanaka took his own life only hours before the emperor's broadcast finally aired to the nation at noon. Japan never knew, in that moment, how close its own military had come to erasing the surrender before the country had even heard the words. MacArthur knew, and it confirmed everything he already suspected. Defeat, on its own, was not enough. Belief could survive defeat. Myth could survive defeat. Unless the surrender was made so total, so visible, and so structurally undeniable that no soldier, no general, and no future movement could ever credibly claim that Japan's military had not truly lost, the war might never fully end in the minds of the people who had fought it. He began with the ship. The USS Missouri was chosen for very specific reasons. She was among the most powerful battleships afloat, named after the home state of President Harry Truman, and MacArthur ordered her anchored directly in Tokyo Bay, in the harbor of the enemy capital itself. Her presence there said something no speech ever could. This was not neutral ground. This was conquered ground, and the conquerors had sailed their steel directly into it. He chose the placement of the surrender table with the same precision. A simple table covered in green cloth, set in the center of the deck, not a negotiating table, not positioned as though two equal parties were meeting halfway. The Japanese delegation would stand on one side. The Allied representatives would stand on the other. There was only one way to read that arrangement, and MacArthur made certain there was no other way available. Then came the witnesses, and this is where MacArthur's understanding of the moment became something closer to architecture than ceremony. He did not simply fill the deck with senior officers for the sake of rank. He placed two specific men directly in his own line of sight, positioned exactly where the Japanese delegation would be forced to see them the instant they looked up from the documents. General Jonathan Wainwright, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. You need to understand who these two men were, because MacArthur certainly did. Wainwright had commanded American and Filipino forces in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1941. He fought as long as any commander reasonably could. He ran out of food. He ran out of medicine. He ran out of ammunition. And eventually he ran out of men who could still stand. In May of 1942, in one of the most agonizing decisions of his career, he surrendered the fortress of Corregidor. He spent the following 3 years and 4 months as a prisoner of the Japanese military. In those camps he lost roughly 60 pounds. He was starved, humiliated, and forced into labor under conditions that killed thousands of the men who had once served under him. By September of 1945, he was 59 years old, and he looked considerably older. Percival had commanded the British garrison at Singapore. In February of 1942, he surrendered to General Tomoyuki Yamashita with roughly 85,000 troops under his command, the largest capitulation in the history of the British military. Japanese propaganda had celebrated the moment for years afterward as living proof of Western weakness. A photograph of Percival walking toward Japanese lines beneath a white flag had been printed on posters across occupied Asia. MacArthur had specifically requested that both men be present on that deck. He arranged for them to stand directly behind him as the Japanese delegation signed. When General Umezu and Foreign Minister Shigemitsu finally looked up from the surrender documents, the first thing in their field of vision would be the living evidence of exactly what this ceremony was reversing. There would be no visual escape from it. The message had been built directly into the room, long before a single word was spoken. At 8:56 that morning, the Japanese delegation arrived. 11 men in 2 groups. Military officers first, civilian diplomats behind them. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu came up the gangway leaning on a cane. In 1932, a Korean independence activist had thrown a bomb at a Japanese ceremony in Shanghai. Shigemitsu had lost a leg in that blast. He climbed the gangway slowly, visibly straining with every step, and every American officer on that deck watched him do it in silence. Umezu followed, dress uniform, rows of medals, a ceremonial sword at his hip. His face was exactly what Japanese military tradition demanded of him in that moment, a mask of absolute stillness. His body was held with a correctness so rigid that it communicated a message all its own. He was not a man accepting defeat. He was a soldier fulfilling an imperial order. In his own mind there was a difference, and he intended that difference to be seen by every man watching him. MacArthur let the delegation reach the table. He let them stand there, in the gray morning light, in front of hundreds of silent witnesses, for exactly as long as it took to feel the weight of it. Only then did he arrive, walking with his long, unhurried stride, and step up to the microphone. The steel deck beneath everyone's boots still held the damp chill of the harbor air. Somewhere below, the engines of the Missouri idled in a low, steady hum that seemed to press against the silence rather than break it. Gulls wheeled somewhere over the water, indifferent to the fact that history was about to be signed into permanence a few feet beneath them. Men who had spent 4 years of their lives dodging shell fire and burying friends now stood shoulder to shoulder in dress uniforms that had been pressed for exactly this morning, and not one of them made a sound. MacArthur looked out at the assembled officers first, then at the Japanese delegation standing rigid on the far side of the green cloth table. His voice, when it came through the microphone, was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had already decided precisely how this moment would end before it began. He announced that the parties present would now execute the terms of formal surrender. No flourish, no triumph in the delivery, just a statement of fact, offered the way a man reads a verdict he has already written. Shigemitsu lowered himself into the chair at the table, set his cane against his leg, and reached for the documents. He looked down at the pages. He appeared to be reading them, slowly, carefully, for what witnesses later described as an agonizing stretch of time. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. The hesitation was visible to every man on that deck, and nobody moved to explain it, and nobody dared to guess at what it meant. Was it grief? Was it defiance? Was it simply an old man's hands refusing to do what his mind had already accepted? MacArthur did not fill the silence. He watched. He let the minute stretch until it became almost unbearable, and only then, in a voice that several accounts describe as sharp and quiet at once, did he turn to his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, and instruct him to show the foreign minister exactly where to sign. Sutherland stepped forward. He pointed to the line. Shigemitsu signed. Umezu came next, and he did something Shigemitsu had not. He did not sit down. He leaned forward from the waist, standing, and wrote his name in one motion. As though sitting in that chair would have been its own kind of surrender, he was not yet willing to perform. He did not look at MacArthur. He did not glance at the Allied officers across the table, including the 2 gaunt former prisoners standing in his direct line of sight. He signed, straightened his back, and returned to his position among the Japanese delegation. His expression never changed, not once, not for a fraction of a second that any photograph or film reel ever captured. And here is the thing that MacArthur understood before anyone else on that deck fully articulated it. None of it mattered. Not the stillness in Umezu's face, not the sword at his hip, not the refusal to sit, not the refusal to bow. None of it touched what was actually happening, because MacArthur had not designed a ceremony that required the Japanese delegation to perform submission with their bodies. He had built a ceremony in which submission was already complete the moment they arrived, the moment they climbed that gangway, the moment they stood on that side of the table and placed their names on a document that would be preserved for the entirety of recorded history. Japan surrendered. The war in the Pacific ended here. These are the names of the men who signed it. You could hold your spine straight, you could keep your face carved from stone, you could refuse every visible gesture of humiliation available to you. The architecture of the room had already finished the sentence, with or without your permission. The signing took 23 minutes from beginning to end. When the final Allied representative set down his pen, MacArthur returned to the microphone and spoke of peace, of a better world he hoped would follow, of a future in which the Japanese people would have a place in it, not out of sentiment, but out of strategy, because a defeated people left with no future are the raw material of the next war. Then, as if timed by some higher authority, or perhaps simply by MacArthur himself, which in the Pacific Theater often amounted to the same thing, a low thunder began building across the overcast sky. Hundreds of aircraft, B-29 bombers and carrier planes in tight formation, swept over Tokyo Bay in a display timed to the second. The sound rolled across the water, filled every man's chest, and then faded into nothing. Umezu had not bowed, but he had signed his name beneath an instrument of surrender, in front of hundreds of witnesses, on an American battleship anchored in Japanese waters, with two men his own army had once starved and humiliated, standing close enough behind MacArthur to be seen in every photograph taken that morning. The bow had never been the point. It was the smallest, least important part of what had happened on that deck. MacArthur had understood something that centuries of Japanese military tradition had not prepared its officers to counter. You do not need a man to kneel if you have already built the room that makes him small. The ceremony was over. MacArthur folded his prepared remarks and stepped back from the microphone. He now had 17 minutes of film footage, hundreds of photographs, 2 signed original documents, and the sworn testimony of hundreds of witnesses to everything that had occurred on that deck. But almost nobody watching that gray morning understood what he understood standing there. The ceremony on the Missouri was only the foundation. The real contest, the one that would decide whether this surrender actually held, whether it became permanent, whether Japan would rise again as a partner or smolder for decades toward a second war, had not even begun. And within 72 hours, MacArthur would be forced to make a decision so unexpected that it would alarm his own government and violate nearly every instinct a victorious commander is supposed to follow. MacArthur had signed no documents himself that morning. He did not need to. His name was already written into what the ceremony meant. But the pressure that reached his headquarters within hours of the Missouri sailing back into calmer waters was not ceremonial at all. It was political, and it was aimed directly at the one decision he had not yet made. Here is a number that almost nobody remembers today. In September of 1945, MacArthur had roughly 400,000 American troops available to administer a nation of nearly 80 million people spread across 4 main islands, with a shattered economy and a military culture that had spent decades teaching its citizens that surrender was a form of death. 1 soldier for roughly every 200 civilians. That ratio was not an occupation force in any conventional sense. It was closer to a skeleton crew standing in the doorway of a house that could still, in theory, burn down around them. And MacArthur understood that if the wrong decision landed in the first 72 hours after the ceremony, that skeleton crew would not hold anything together at all. Every senior officer on his staff had studied the German occupation model after the First World War, and every one of them understood the lesson buried inside it. A defeated nation left to nurse its own myths in private, without a clear and undeniable reckoning imposed from outside, does not heal. It ferments. Given 20 years, resentment curdles into ideology, and ideology finds a leader willing to promise that the humiliation was never real, that the army was stabbed in the back rather than beaten on the field, that the whole surrender was a betrayal rather than a defeat. That fermentation had produced a man named Adolf Hitler, and a war that had just cost tens of millions of lives across 2 hemispheres. MacArthur was determined, down to the smallest procedural detail of the occupation, that Japan would not be given the same 20 years to tell itself the same comforting lie. The pressure came fastest from Washington. Secretary of State James Burns cabled MacArthur's headquarters within hours of the signing, with a recommendation carrying real weight inside the Truman administration. Arrest Emperor Hirohito. Charge him before an Allied tribunal. Try him alongside the generals who had planned and executed the war. The logic was not unreasonable on its face. You could not hold Nazi leadership accountable while allowing the head of the Japanese state to remain untouched inside his own palace. The optics were difficult to defend. The principle, on paper, was hard to argue against. Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, MacArthur's military secretary and one of his closest advisors on Japanese affairs, walked into MacArthur's temporary headquarters in Yokohama on the evening of September the 2nd with that cable in his hand. Fellers had spent years studying Japanese psychology and culture. He had written the assessments that shaped American psychological operations across the entire Pacific Campaign, and he understood, in a way few American officers did, what the figure of the emperor actually meant to ordinary Japanese citizens, farmers, mothers, former soldiers, all of them. The office in Yokohama was sparse that evening, little more than a requisitioned room with a desk, a lamp, and maps of Japan pinned along one wall, their pins and grease pencil marks still tracking the invasion that had just been canceled by a signature on a battleship deck. MacArthur read the cable once, slowly, the way he read every document that mattered. He set it down on the desk without any visible reaction. According to Fellers's later account, MacArthur looked at him and asked a single question before offering any judgment of his own. How many troops, in Fellers's professional estimate, would it take to physically hold down a nation of 80 million people if its emperor were dragged away in chains? Fellers did not have a precise number ready, and MacArthur supplied one for him. If they arrested Hirohito, MacArthur said, he would need 1 million men to hold the country together. Fellers told him plainly that they did not have 1 million men and had no realistic path to getting them. MacArthur answered that they were not then going to arrest Hirohito. It sounds like a simple calculation stated in a quiet room. It was, in fact, an extraordinarily dangerous one. MacArthur was about to directly contradict the recommendation of the Secretary of State, override the instinct of the Truman administration itself, and make a unilateral judgment about the single most politically sensitive figure in the entire occupied nation, based on nothing but his own reading of Japanese society. If he was wrong, there would be no undoing it. If violence broke out across the home islands, if hardline factions rallied around a martyred emperor, if the entire occupation collapsed into chaos, every death that followed would belong to him. He cabled Washington the following morning. The message was direct, almost blunt in its phrasing. Arresting the emperor would create a martyr, not deliver justice. It would guarantee instability rather than prevent it. The occupation required a stable, functioning administrative structure, and the emperor, whatever his wartime responsibility, was the only figure in the country capable of providing one without bloodshed. MacArthur recommended against the arrest and stated his intention to meet privately with Hirohito before any further decisions were made about his fate. Washington was not pleased with the answer, but MacArthur held the title of Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, and he was already moving forward with his own plan, regardless of how Washington felt about it. He set up his headquarters inside the Dai-ichi Insurance Building, a 6-story Western-style structure standing directly across the moat from the grounds of the Imperial Palace. Every citizen of Tokyo walking past the palace each morning could look across the water and see the building where the Supreme Commander now worked. MacArthur kept to a routine so fixed it became a kind of civic clock for the city, arriving at his desk at almost the same hour every day, working through a stack of decisions that would have overwhelmed a much larger staff, and departing in the evening along a route that Tokyo residents reportedly began timing their own errands around, simply to catch a glimpse of the man now running their country. MacArthur had not chosen that headquarters location by accident. The new geography of authority in Japan was written into the daily skyline of its own capital, visible to anyone who simply looked up. The meeting itself was scheduled for the morning of September the 27th, 25 days after the ceremony aboard the Missouri, at the American Embassy in Tokyo. On that morning, Emperor Hirohito dressed in formal Western morning clothes, a black coat, striped trousers, a top hat, and traveled to the embassy in a motorcade. According to Japanese imperial tradition, he was believed to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. He had never once in his entire life traveled anywhere to meet another man as an equal. Other men traveled to meet him. The journey itself, before he had even set foot inside the building, was already a statement more direct than anything spoken at the surrender ceremony 25 days earlier. The streets his motorcade passed through were still scarred from American bombing runs the previous spring, entire blocks reduced to blackened frames and cleared rubble, ordinary Tokyo residents pausing along the roadside to watch the imperial car pass in a silence that had nothing celebratory in it at all. For most of the people watching, this alone was almost impossible to process. Their emperor, a figure many of them had been raised to regard as sacred and untouchable, was traveling through the wreckage of his own capital to sit across a table from the general who had defeated him. No emperor in the recorded history of Japan had ever done anything remotely similar. MacArthur received him wearing an open-collared khaki uniform. No jacket, no medals. The same uniform he wore every single day of that year. He did not dress up for emperors, and everyone in that room understood exactly what that choice communicated. The meeting lasted 37 minutes. No formal transcript exists, by MacArthur's specific instruction. What is known of the conversation comes from the recollections of the interpreters present in the room. Hirohito reportedly spoke first, stating that he had come to offer himself to the judgment of the Allied powers, that responsibility for the war rested with him personally, and that he would accept whatever decision MacArthur and the Allied authorities made regarding his own fate. MacArthur, by multiple accounts, was visibly moved by the statement. He had expected a man performing submission for political survival. What he received, in a private room with no audience and no obvious political advantage to be gained from the words, appeared to be something closer to genuine acceptance of consequence. Whether it was entirely sincere or an extraordinarily well-judged act of political survival, MacArthur could never know with total certainty. What he did know was that the moment offered him something he needed far more than an apology. It offered him a partner. MacArthur extended his hand. After the meeting, a photographer was brought into the embassy's entrance hall. The photograph taken that day shows MacArthur in his plain khakis, standing noticeably taller and entirely relaxed, beside Hirohito in his formal morning dress, rigid, small, and visibly uncertain. The contrast was not staged to humiliate anyone. It was staged, carefully, to record something. That photograph ran on the front page of major Japanese newspapers 2 days later, on September the 29th. It ran across the front pages of the Allied world within days after that. Officials at Japan's own Home Ministry, still exercising control over domestic newspapers in the final weeks before full occupation censorship rules took hold, were outraged by the image and moved to have it banned, viewing it as a humiliation of the throne itself. MacArthur's headquarters overruled the ban outright, insisting the photograph be printed exactly as taken, without retouching and without a caption softening its meaning. In a single image, without a single word of explanation required, it communicated the new structure of authority inside occupied Japan more completely than any decree could have, while also handing millions of Japanese readers their first real lesson in what a free press, even one still operating under occupation rules, could actually do. The emperor remained on his throne, but the source of his legitimacy, visibly and undeniably, had changed hands. MacArthur moved quickly to convert that new reality into concrete policy. Through a series of directives issued across the following weeks, he began dismantling the entire structure of imperial military authority, beginning with the formal abolition of the armed forces themselves. On October the 15th, 1945, 6 weeks after the ceremony aboard the Missouri, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy ceased to exist as legal institutions. Men who had built their entire sense of purpose around service to those institutions, who had believed with total sincerity that discipline in the emperor's name was the highest expression a human life could reach, were now, by simple legal decree, civilians. What made the demobilization that followed remarkable was not force, it was the absence of it. Rather than send American units across the home islands to physically disarm hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers at gunpoint, which risked producing exactly the kind of violent confrontations and martyrs that could unravel the entire occupation, MacArthur worked through the very chain of command those soldiers had spent their lives obeying. Imperial rescripts carrying the emperor's own authority ordered Japanese commanders across the islands and the wider Pacific to lay down their weapons and return home. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground, in ports up and down the Japanese coastline through the autumn and winter of 1945. Long columns of men in worn uniforms filing off transport ships that had carried them home from postings in China, Manchuria, and the islands of the southern Pacific, many of them thinner than the men who had shipped out years earlier, carrying almost nothing beyond a single duffel bag and whatever paperwork proved they had served. Rifles stacked in growing pyramids on the docks. Officers surrendering swords that had, in many cases, belonged to their own fathers. No American soldiers stood over them with weapons raised. In most ports, the process looked less like a military disarmament and more like a slow, exhausted homecoming, men simply following the orders of an emperor whose voice they had only heard broadcast once in their entire lives, but whose authority still moved through them like a current they had never learned to disobey. Over the following months, more than 7 million Japanese soldiers and sailors were demobilized inside the home islands, with several million more repatriated from postings scattered across Asia and the Pacific. The largest military force the region had ever produced was dissolved, almost entirely without further bloodshed, inside a matter of months, a demobilization on a scale and at a speed that MacArthur's own planners had not fully believed possible when they first drafted their estimates back in August. The harder problem was never the soldiers holding rifles. It was the society those soldiers were returning to, and the deeper structures that had made the war possible in the first place. MacArthur then did something that startled even members of his own staff. He instructed his government section to begin drafting an entirely new Japanese constitution, not to impose American law wholesale onto a defeated nation, not to demand that Japan remake itself as a copy of the United States. The goal was narrower and, in its own way, far more radical. Design a constitutional structure that made the specific conditions which had produced the war, unchecked military authority, a suppressed civilian government, an emperor whose image had been used as a political weapon, structurally impossible to reproduce in the future. The core draft was reportedly completed by MacArthur's staff inside a period of roughly 1 week in February of 1946, an astonishing pace for a document meant to govern an entire nation. The team assigned to the task was a small group of American officers and civilian lawyers working inside the government section of MacArthur's headquarters, many of them still in their 30s, working around the clock from borrowed law libraries and whatever constitutional texts they could gather from half a dozen democracies, because MacArthur had given them a matter of days, not months, to produce something durable enough to reshape an empire. When Japanese officials first saw the American draft, several were reportedly stunned by both its speed and its scope. It was then negotiated with Japanese officials, revised, translated, and eventually adopted by the Imperial Diet in November of 1946, coming into full force on May 3, 1947. The finished document contained one article, with no real precedent in the constitutional history of any modern nation. Article 9. Japan renounced war permanently as a sovereign right, committing itself in its own foundational law to never again maintain offensive military capability. The same nation that had built one of the largest naval air forces in the world, that had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had occupied territory stretching from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, now wrote into its own constitution a promise to never wage war again. The new constitution carried other changes just as significant, even if they drew far less attention outside Japan. It extended the right to vote to women for the first time in the nation's history. It stripped the emperor of political and military authority entirely, redefining his role as a symbol of the state rather than its sovereign ruler. Alongside the constitutional process, MacArthur's occupation authorities pushed through a sweeping land reform program that redistributed farmland from a small class of landlords to the millions of tenant farmers who actually worked it, and moved to dissolve the great Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates that had financed and profited from the war economy for over a decade. General Yoshijiro Umezu was arrested and imprisoned at Sugamo Prison by December of 1945. He would be tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convicted of war crimes in November of 1948, and he would die inside that prison in January of 1949, a little over 3 years after standing at rigid attention on the deck of the Missouri with his ceremonial sword at his hip and his face arranged into an expression of controlled refusal. He had refused to bow. He had held his composure through every second of that ceremony, giving MacArthur nothing visible to point to as submission. None of it had made the smallest difference to anything that followed. MacArthur had built a system in which visible defiance simply did not register, because the outcome had never depended on how any single man chose to hold his face. None of this happened in a straight line, and none of it happened without resistance from inside MacArthur's own command. Bonner Fellers spent the weeks after the Missouri ceremony fielding a steady stream of cables from Allied capitals, demanding a harder line. Australia, a nation that had suffered directly under Japanese aggression, formally listed Hirohito among its roster of major war criminals and pushed for his arrest. The Soviet Union, sitting on the Allied Council overseeing the occupation, regularly clashed with MacArthur over how far the purge of Japan's old guard should reach. MacArthur held his position through all of it, calculating, correctly as it turned out, that a functioning government staffed by experienced Japanese administrators, operating under his direct authority, would stabilize the country faster than a wholesale replacement of that government with inexperienced officials chosen by the occupying power. That did not mean MacArthur left the existing power structure untouched. Between 1946 and 1948, occupation authorities carried out a sweeping purge of public life, removing roughly 200,000 individuals from positions of influence across government, business, and education because of their roles in the war effort or their affiliation with ultranationalist organizations. Former military officers were barred from holding public office. Newspaper editors who had spent the war years printing government propaganda were removed from their posts. School textbooks that had taught Japanese children the doctrine of their nation's divine destiny were physically pulled from classrooms, in some documented cases with students ordered to black out entire passages with ink before a single new book could be printed to replace them. Teachers stood at the front of crowded, poorly heated classrooms reading aloud which paragraphs to cross out, while children who had been taught for years that dying for the emperor was the highest honor available to them now sat inking over the very sentences that had told them so. At the same time, occupation authorities imposed a press and radio code that placed strict limits on what Japanese media could publish, banning criticism of the occupation itself, banning content that glorified militarism, and requiring newspapers to submit material for review before publication. It was, by any honest accounting, a form of censorship, and it sat uneasily beside a constitution that MacArthur's own staff was simultaneously drafting to guarantee freedom of speech. MacArthur justified the contradiction as a temporary and necessary measure, a scaffold that would be removed once the underlying structure it protected was strong enough to stand without it. Historians have debated that justification for decades since, and the tension between control and freedom remained one of the defining paradoxes of the entire occupation, a man building a free press for a nation he was not yet willing to trust with one. Economic conditions across Japan, in the winter of 1945 into 1946, were bleak enough to threaten the entire project on their own. American strategic bombing had destroyed roughly a quarter of the nation's building stock and a substantial share of its industrial capacity. Food shortages were severe enough that occupation planners spent the winter genuinely worried about mass starvation across Japan's major cities. MacArthur pressed Washington for emergency food shipments, arguing bluntly that a starving population made a far more dangerous population than a defeated one, and that hunger, not lingering military pride, was the single greatest threat to the stability he was trying to build. A population too hungry to work, in his calculation, was a population with nothing left to lose, and nothing left to lose was precisely the condition that had made ordinary Germans willing to follow extraordinary men. Millions of tons of American food aid moved into Japanese ports over the following 2 years, a decision that received almost none of the attention given to the more dramatic political moments of the occupation, but which likely did more than any single speech to keep the country from collapsing into chaos during its most fragile winter. Meanwhile, the machinery of accountability was already turning. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo in the spring of 1946, prosecuting 28 senior Japanese military and political leaders on charges connected to the planning and conduct of the war. General Umezu, arrested that December, would eventually stand among them. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, the same man who had climbed the gangway of the Missouri leaning on his cane, was arrested as well and brought before the same tribunal, accused of failing to prevent atrocities committed during his time in government, even as he had personally signed the instrument that ended the war he had not started. The tribunal's proceedings dragged on for well over 2 years, longer than the Nuremberg trials in Europe, complicated by disagreements among the Allied justices over jurisdiction, evidence, and the proper scope of individual responsibility inside a system of collective military command. 11 judges from 11 different Allied nations sat on the bench, each bringing their own nation's legal traditions and their own nation's wartime grievances into a courtroom, trying to establish, almost from scratch, what accountability for a modern industrialized war was even supposed to look like. Umezu's defense argued that as chief of the Army General Staff, he had followed the decisions of the civilian government and the Emperor's own council, not shaped them independently, a position not far removed from the rigid composure he had carried onto the deck of the Missouri 3 years earlier, the same insistence that he had been an instrument of duty rather than an architect of catastrophe. The tribunal was unconvinced. He was found guilty on multiple counts related to the planning and waging of aggressive war, and sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence he would serve for barely 2 years before his death inside Sugamo. By the time the Constitution took effect in May of 1947, Japan had already held its first post-war general election, in April of 1946, the first in which Japanese women were permitted to vote. Roughly 13.8 million women cast ballots in that election, choosing 39 women among the candidates elected to the new Diet, a number without precedent anywhere in the nation's political history. MacArthur, watching from across the moat in the Daiichi building, treated the result less as a symbolic victory and more as a practical proof of concept. A defeated, occupied, deeply traditional society had, within less than a year of total war, participated peacefully in a democratic process broader than anything it had ever attempted before, lining up outside polling stations that in many towns still stood beside bombed-out shells of the buildings that used to house them. The land reform program alone reshaped the physical foundation of Japanese rural life more completely than any single piece of wartime legislation ever had. Within roughly 3 years, close to 6 million acres of farmland, nearly a third of all cultivated land in the country, was purchased from about 2.3 million landlords, most of them for prices so low that post-war inflation reduced the payments to something close to symbolic, and resold to nearly 4.7 million tenant farming households. By 1950, the share of Japanese farmland still worked under the old tenancy system had collapsed from nearly half to roughly 10%. Men who had spent their entire lives working soil that belonged to someone else now owned it outright, and MacArthur understood, with the same cold clarity he had brought to the deck of the Missouri, that a farmer who owns his own land has very little incentive to support a movement promising to burn the existing order to the ground. Critics on both the political left and right accuse the reform of moving too fast, of trampling property rights, of rewarding some tenants while leaving others behind, depending on the accident of which prefecture they farmed in. MacArthur pushed it through regardless, treating the criticism as background noise against a goal he considered non-negotiable. None of it was guaranteed to hold. None of it was guaranteed to survive contact with the deeper resentments still moving quietly beneath the surface of a nation that had just lost everything it had spent a generation building. A constitution on paper does not automatically become a constitution in practice. A land deed does not automatically erase decades of resentment between a family that once owned the field and a family that now farmed it. A photograph does not automatically convince every soldier who had once knelt at the mention of the emperor's name that kneeling no longer meant anything at all. MacArthur had built the architecture. Whether that architecture would actually hold once the cameras were gone and the ceremonies were finished, and ordinary life resumed its slow, uncertain rhythm across a broken country, remained an open question in the autumn of 1946. And the men who had stood closest to MacArthur on the deck of the Missouri, the ones who had watched Umezu refuse to bow with their own eyes, were about to discover exactly how differently their own lives would unfold from that single shared morning. MacArthur remained in Japan far longer than almost anyone in 1945 would have predicted. He ran the occupation for nearly 6 years, watching the Constitution take root, watching the first post-war elections settle into a functioning parliamentary rhythm, watching the economy claw its way back up from the wreckage of 1945, one factory and one rice harvest at a time. Then, in April of 1951, during an entirely different war on an entirely different peninsula, it ended for him just as abruptly as it had begun for the men who signed on the Missouri. President Harry Truman relieved MacArthur of his command on April the 11th, 1951, in the middle of the Korean War, after MacArthur had publicly and repeatedly contradicted the administration's policy on whether to expand that conflict into China. It was about as blunt a firing as American military history has ever recorded, delivered not in person but through a radio bulletin that reached MacArthur's own staff in Tokyo before it reached the general himself through official channels. The man who had once dictated the terms of an empire's surrender was himself removed from command by a single presidential order, with no ceremony, no green cloth table, and no 23 minutes of careful staging to soften the message. He returned to the United States for the first time in over a decade to a ticker-tape parade through the streets of New York, crowds packing the sidewalks for a man most Americans had only ever known through newspaper photographs and newsreel footage. On April the 19th, 1951, he stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered a speech that produced one of the most quoted lines in the history of American military rhetoric. He told them that old soldiers never die, they simply fade away, and then, by his own choice, he largely did exactly that. He settled into a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City and lived there quietly for the next 13 years, making only occasional public appearances, never once returning to the country he had governed for 6 years. The man who had once dictated the terms under which an emperor and 80 million people would live now spent his final years largely out of the public eye, a private citizen in a hotel suite a short walk from the same streets that had once cheered his return. He was admitted to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in early March of 1964 and died there on April the 5th, after more than a month as a patient. He was 84 years old. He never saw the full arc of what his occupation had set in motion. He saw only its earliest years, the first stirrings of economic recovery, the early operation of institutions his own staff had drafted in borrowed law libraries. He did not live to see Japan become, within a single generation, the second largest economy on Earth, a transformation later economists would call an economic miracle. The Japanese people built that themselves, through their own labor and their own ingenuity, rebuilding cities that had been reduced to ash and rubble into some of the most advanced industrial centers on the planet. But the conditions that made it possible, the land reform, the dissolution of the old industrial combines, the stable constitutional government, the security arrangement that let Japan redirect its spending away from armies and toward factories, those conditions had been built, piece by piece, inside the Daiichi building across the moat from the palace, between 1945 and 1951. The Constitution itself proved to be perhaps the single most durable document MacArthur's staff ever produced, written in roughly a week by American lawyers who were, by their own later admission, never entirely certain it would survive contact with Japanese political reality. It has not been formally amended even once in the more than 7 decades since it took effect, an extraordinary record for any national constitution, let alone one drafted at speed by a foreign occupying power for a nation that had never governed itself under anything like it before. Article 9 in particular became something far larger than a legal clause. It became, for generation after generation of Japanese citizens raised without the memory of Pearl Harbor or Nanking or the firebombing of Tokyo, simply the water they swam in, an assumption about their own country so basic that most of them rarely stopped to consider how strange its origin actually was. The men who had stood across that green cloth table from him followed very different paths after that gray September morning. General Umezu never left Sugamo prison alive. The prison itself sat only a few miles from the palace grounds where he had once argued so furiously that Japan should fight to the last civilian rather than surrender, a proximity that made his final years feel, to those who studied his case afterward, almost like a deliberate irony written by history itself rather than by any single man's design. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, the man who had climbed the gangway leaning on his cane and hesitated so visibly over the surrender documents, was tried by the same tribunal and convicted on lesser charges. He was released from prison in 1950, returned to public life, and remarkably served again as Japan's foreign minister in 1954, the same office he had held on the morning he signed his nation's surrender. The civilian diplomat who had once put his signature beneath an instrument ending a war he had not started, went on, less than a decade later, to sign treaties on behalf of the very nation that document had reshaped, walking back into rooms full of the same foreign diplomats he had once faced across a green cloth table, this time not as a defeated envoy, but as a working partner in the post-war order that his own signature had helped create. General Wainwright, the gaunt former prisoner MacArthur had deliberately placed in his own line of sight that morning, was awarded the Medal of Honor after his return home, promoted to full general, and given a hero's welcome that had eluded him for the 3 years and 4 months he spent starving in Japanese captivity. He retired from the Army in 1947 and died in San Antonio, Texas, on September 2, 1953, exactly 8 years to the day after he stood behind MacArthur on that battleship deck. He had outlived the men who once imprisoned him, and he had lived to see the empire that humiliated him formally, legally, and permanently dismantled. The soldier who had entered the war years as one of the more obscure commanders in the Philippines had ended it as a household name across the entire United States, and the date on his headstone would forever tie him back to that single September morning, whether the coincidence had been intended by anyone at all or not. Lieutenant General Percival's path was quieter and considerably less kind. He retired from the British Army in 1946 and published a restrained account of the fall of Singapore in 1949, an attempt to explain, without excusing, how 85,000 men under his command had surrendered to a Japanese force roughly a third that size. Unlike Wainwright, Percival was never celebrated as a hero back home. The stain of Singapore, then and for decades afterward regarded as one of the worst defeats in British military history, followed him for the rest of his life. He died in London on January 31, 1966, having spent 2 decades watching his own nation reckon slowly and often unkindly with what his surrender had come to symbolize. Two men had stood in nearly identical positions on that deck in Tokyo Bay, both former prisoners of the same enemy, both placed there by MacArthur for the exact same symbolic purpose. Yet one went home to parades and a Medal of Honor, and the other went home to 2 decades of quiet, largely unspoken judgment from his own countrymen, a reminder that history rarely distributes its verdicts evenly, no matter how similar the circumstances behind them happen to be. Here is the number that closes the story more completely than any single ceremony could. Military planners in the summer of 1945, preparing for what would have been called Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, produced casualty estimates so grim that they varied wildly depending on which assumptions were used, ranging from roughly 250,000 to as many as 1 million American dead and wounded, and estimates for Japanese military and civilian casualties running as high as 5 to 10 million lives. That invasion never happened. The surrender on the Missouri and the 6 years of occupation that followed it replaced it with a transition that cost a fraction of that toll in every measurable category, in lives, in money, and in the kind of generational bitterness that prolonged occupations by force tend to leave behind for decades. Weigh that fact against the image of one general refusing to lower his head on a battleship deck, and the true scale of what actually happened that morning starts to come into focus. A ceremony that took 23 minutes to perform may have quietly saved more lives than almost any single military operation of the entire Pacific War. MacArthur did not win the Pacific War by himself. The sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines who fought across 9,000 miles of ocean and jungle and volcanic island did that, at a cost that history has never fully finished counting. But the man who stood at that microphone on the deck of the Missouri and then crossed the moat into the capital of a broken empire and spent 6 years converting a military surrender into a durable peace, built something that the fighting alone could never have produced on its own. Japan has not fought a war since that September morning. Not one, in 81 years. The nation that had built the largest battleship in naval history, that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had occupied territory stretching from Manchuria to New Guinea, has lived under a constitution that renounces war as a matter of law for longer than most nations on earth have existed as democracies at all. Sons and grandsons of the men who once filed off those repatriation ships in 1945 grew up in a country that simply did not maintain an army in the way every generation before theirs had understood the word, an inheritance so complete that most of them never thought to question where it had actually come from. Umezu had refused to bow. He kept his spine straight, his face carved into stillness, his ceremonial sword resting against his hip, right up until the moment he signed his own name, beneath the end of everything he had spent his life serving. He died in a prison cell a little over 3 years later, convicted under a legal system created by a document drafted inside a building standing just across the moat from the palace where he had once served. MacArthur had never needed the bow. He had already built the room, and in the end, that may be the only lesson from that gray Tokyo morning that still matters 8 decades later. The deepest kind of defeat was never written in how straight a man managed to stand while it happened to him. It was written into the architecture around him, built so completely, so patiently, and so permanently that the only thing left for history to argue about was the posture he chose to hold while the sentence was already being finished, word by word, without needing his permission at all. Somewhere in Sugamo in the winter of 1948, a man who had once stood at rigid attention on the deck of a battleship sat in a small cell, still holding his back straight out of habit, more than defiance now, waiting for a tribunal built by the very occupation his refusal to bow had failed to slow down for even a single day. He had given the cameras nothing. History had taken everything anyway.